Increment Ray is back. And this will be part 2 of historical analysis of neo-colonialism. When last we spoke, I was covering the, I believe it was what happened inside Africa and America after World War II, the forms that struggle took. I believe I was talking about pressures internally and externally, I believe. On one hand, I'll just recap it real quick as I move on. Internal pressure in the capitalist states. You had the labor movement through the strength of the workers' organizations, collective bargaining. That was the internal pressure. It was really a fight for better working conditions and a larger share of the wealth of the United States and the Western blocs as well, where this was also going on. Externally, of course, that pressure through the imperialist theater of action, which is beyond the borders of the capitalist state. It's domestic borders. Experienced an expansion of liberation movements that put in the threat of the ending of the exploitation efforts of resources. And that was something that the West had to resolve. But they had to do it in a way that continued the exploitation, continued ever-increasing profits from the only minority of the multinational corporations, which were growing in Africa and other areas that I'll mention. And at the same time, alleviate the demands to the point where it would not affect the first two. Internally, they came up with the welfare state for that. The colonies, because of that, the colonies had to be even more systematically exploited for that, because that's where the profit was going to come from to do that. So it was a welfare state, but they needed fascism also to facilitate that. We know welfare state reforms on one hand, but externally, a greater need to put more emphasis on exploitation to do that. However, the strategy externally was to grant independence, or at least a cosmetic independence. In other words, a regime change. Two things happened there. As I explained it earlier. Genuine independent states came out of that. Very few, but most of them were puppet states. So you had black faces or African faces, but the hidden hand, the power was still behind that change. So by and large, the French were still involved, the British, Belgium, and the Congo, etc. But a more collective exploitation of the participating countries taken from Africa had to be more organized. That was through the ancillary product called Neo-Colonialism. That was the profound change, so that they could again find solutions for the internal pressure by reform, internally, externally, granting nominal independence on one hand, but also a more systematic exploitation of the wealth, and really a more political subjugation of the people, but also allowing, I guess, through their control, a more participatory activity in the colony in terms of upward mobility, education, those things as well. But they were really only cosmetic because they're even there at that particular point, those so-called improvements were concerted to actually aid the exploitation in terms of the wealth to be shipped over into the Western nations. So, you know, the external reforms designed to raise the extra money needed for the establishment and maintenance of the welfare state at home. So, but in other words, the capitalist economy had to depend more heavily than ever on the resources of colonial territories. And that was on the external front. Okay, but they had to collectively carry out reforms in order to eliminate the deadly threat. That was a liberation movement. As I said earlier, the expansive liberation, mass movements to do that. So the urgent need for such reforms was made clear. Specifically, we saw that in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where revolutionary movements had not only seized power, but were actually consolidating their gains. Such as it is, for instance, development in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, China, Cuba, North Vietnam and North Korea, and then Egypt, Ghana, Guinea, I believe Mali, yes, and Algeria, and I believe other parts of Africa, yes. Now, this not only showed that the world balance of forces was shifting, but the imperialist states of capitalism were confronted with a real danger of encirclement. So that was a strategy to cut that off, if you will, to maintain supremacy overseas. Now, collectively, through 2 points I'll just give here quickly. These modifications, they were expressed in these ways. Now, one, they had to get rid of the numerous old-fashioned colonies, crude colonialism, and starting excuse me here, let me gather my thoughts, which owed an exclusive allegiance to a single metropolitan country on one hand. And so they had to replace that with national imperialism or a collective effort of exploitation, in which the U.S. started to occupy a leading position, and in fact, it still does today. The roots of the process itself, though, can be traced back to the period of the Second World War. Now, it's very significant here because the socialist camp was still too small and weak to give decisive assistance to the European working class movement. The workers themselves were therefore all the more easily deflected from the objectives of their struggle, and unfortunately allowed themselves to be dragged into a bloody war. The Second World War strained the political, the economic strength of Europe, and although the capitalist system itself remained relatively intact through it all. But because the true winner was the U.S., because it helped the Allies to win the war. And we all know that the war wasn't fought on the physical body of the mainland of the United States. We're not talking about Hawaii. You know what happened there. I'm talking about the areas that the mainland was preserved, the United States, and ensured really a leading position of the world to acquire increasing influence, political and economic influence, in the life of those exhausted states that were bombed out by Nazi Germany. So this internationalization, it enabled the U.S. to forestall an incipient crisis, which I'll get into in a minute. Now, I had to fulfill two very necessary conditions for that. The first one was the need to expand, which was essentially a U.S. post-war alliance. Now, this not only enabled the U.S. to benefit from the advantages of the European market, which before they had been largely closed and couldn't penetrate, but it also opened up new horizons in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So it's there where the U.S. had superseded European supremacy and established neo-colonialist domination. Second point here, it was the need to militarize. Now, the militarization of the U.S. economy based on a political pretext, or this is what the propaganda said of the time, the political pretext because of the threatening rise of the USSR and the People's Republic of China and socialist powers. The belief in this enabled the USA to postpone the internal crisis that I talked about earlier. First during 1939 to 1945 and post 1945. Another point, well, it's 2 points here in terms of the need to militarize. I have to add here, as the first is that the militarization absorbed the excess of unorganized energy into an intense armament drive. Now that supported Western aggression. And of course, we know that it was untold resources internally through tax dollars that were used that supported this aggression. And also many blocs and alliances were formed over this time. Now, we're seeing at least the last 80 years, easy. Specifically, I'm talking about. But it goes into my second point of militarization. Now, this made possible an expensive policy of paternalist corruption of the poor and oppressed people of the world. It was those profound subjective conditions that you had the expansion and the organized energy of mass movements toward colonial freedom inside of Africa. And also, I might add that the revolutionary states that came out of that, Ghana, Guinea, and Mali respectively, their plans was to take it even further because what their leaders understood, their mindsets, that it wasn't enough to just free themselves of colonial domination, of the physical emplacement of Europeans governing Africans as inferiors in their own land, but to also break through the political borders that was established. And of course, this is still a struggle today in many fronts in Africa that was placed there during the 1885 scramble for Africa, because they're also drawn, irrespective of the axis of cultural, linguistic, and tribal/nation affiliations, so it was very, very significant. Those particular countries, or those particular areas of Africa went further in their policies toward continental unity. The other ones did not. Thought I'd throw that in there. It's very, very important, and later on that'll be covered more in detail. But the principle of mutual assistance in the West, whereby American, British, French, and West German monopoly capital, it extended joint control of the wealth of the non-liberated zones of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Now, this all found concrete expression in the formation of interlocked bodies of credit and international financial institutions. I'll just go over two here: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. There's others, but for this analysis, I'll just only give two. So, even let me add that the West even made use of the United Nations organization in order to camouflage their objective. Now, anybody that objects to that claim need only to look no further than the U.S. policy in South Korea and the Congo. South Korea, 1954, and Congo, 1960, 61. Now, this gets into a brief area that I mentioned. It was the alleviation of the external pressure of the capitalist nation states. This was sham independence in the colonies, granting genuinely, where they couldn't stop it, it had to be genuine independence, which they didn't want at all, really. But for the rest of Africa, it was a sham independence or puppet states. So when I say sham independence and puppet states, they mean the same thing. But this sham independence, as far as the West were concerned, that was the real solution of the problem of their continued exploitation of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So they had to, as I said earlier, relieve that pressure by granting these concessions and reforms. But that's the concept of sham independence. Follow with me, if you will, what Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, had to say about this. I quote, he said, a state can be said to be neo-colonialist or client-held if it is independent de jure, independent de facto. It is a state where political power lies in the conservative forces of the former colony and where economic power remains under the control of international finance capital, end quote. It simply means you just have a regime change. It went from white face to black face, but the people who were there earlier, prior to that change, are still in power. And all the influence that they had before, it's really now increased, because now you have a front, you have a buffer, you have a government that on one hand has all the trappings of political independence, but actually its internal, external policies and its resources are still controlled by that same colonial exploiter. So this was really a more efficient way, in a sense, to alleviate those problems, that pressure, at the same time step up colonial exploitation. So, so it just means the country continues to be economically exploited by it continues to be exploited by interests, alien to it on one hand, to the majority of the people, but it's intrinsic to the world sector controlling that material wealth. So such a state like that is in the grip of neo-colonialism. This is how we get into, I just basically gave you in the nutshell, the process from colonialism into what we still have today, neo-colonialism. Now that is the where we are today, but a prerequisite of a correct, I feel, global strategy to defeat it is the ability for the most affected people, who are Africans, to discover what it is and expose a way in which a state becomes neo-colonialist, as I'm doing here, by breaking it down into its component parts. Now, even today, neo-colonialist states enjoy sham independence. As I said earlier, to outward appearances, independent. And and you can trace that back to the struggle for colonial independence initially when it was set there. But here, a liberation movement has got to be firmly established and sustained. But when, of course, up to this point, that's happened, the colonial power, it tends to resort to a containment policy in order to stop further progress and also deaden its impact. One of the features of neo-colonialism, and the neo-colonialists are the same people who are the colonialists, the foreigners, foreign nations, their policies, government policies, and military force, and foreign firms coming in, dominating these economies for their profit. However, to achieve the objective, the neo-colonial power has to use an arsenal of alliances. I would also add a network of military bases. They've done that over the years, and they're doing that now. In fact, there's been a larger garrisoning of foreign troops in Africa now more than ever, with the intensification of China, of course, inside of African soil, on African soil. So yes, network of military bases, corruption, sabotage, blackmail has been added in there. Very, very heavy on the psychological warfare with propaganda, false propaganda. And this is a view to impressing on the people itself, the African people itself, really what I consider a number of Western dogmas, which are really alien to it. There's really four of them, to be honest with you. There's probably more, but I found four. The first one is that the Western democracy and the parliamentary system are the only valid ways of governing. That, or it's felt that this constitutes the only worthwhile model for the training of the elite that's been created through neo-colonialism, which was given a greater share, upward mobility, access to through the professions, which is thought mainly or one of the main ways of climbing out of poverty. So this is controlled by the colonial power. I think two, that capitalism. Now, understand, there's a part of capitalism that becomes evil, and that's the monopoly, and that's the part I'm talking about. I'm not talking about small businesses or people struggling to survive. That can happen in any nation or society. What I'm talking about is when you get to the point where you have a collective, foreigners controlling everything, and you control nothing when it actually belongs to you. That's the evil part of it. That's the monopoly part that I'm talking about. So I want to differentiate. I don't want anybody thinking I have such a serious problem with capitalism. It's a part of capitalism that becomes evil. And that's what I'm talking about here. So, but the propaganda is that capitalism, free enterprise, they get kind of euphemistic at a given point. Free competition, etc. These are supposed to be, or you're supposed to believe that these are the only political systems capable of promoting development. That the Western powers have mastered this capitalist technique perfectly. And that the colonial territory should become an economic satellite in its own interest. But it isn't. We'll show that. I'll probably go to part 3 and 4 to get to that. But let me just say here that there's no reason to put an end to this policy of cooperation, pursued during the colonial regime. And that any attempt to break away would be dangerous, since the colonial power is always ready to give aid. So that kind of goes into my third. You see how profound that is. But let me go on to the third point here. That, man, slightest lapse on the part of the leaders of the liberation movement could push the country into the grip of communism and totalitarianism and dictatorship. Part of the propaganda. And unfortunately, it's been successful. And then fourth, that this historic carve-up, and I mentioned that earlier, this carve-up of Africa of foreign powers agreed upon by these people during the colonial period is fair and sacred. Can you believe that? That it would be unthinkable even to attempt to liberate these areas in terms of their common cultural and historical links, which is what they should be at this particular point today in 2021. That the only acceptable version of liberation must apply to artificial units, these particular borders here, designed by foreigners. They label them nations, Algeria, Kenya, Senegal, and everything. But, those were that. What we see really is the maintenance of the political frontiers of the West. And it works the same way. They just gave them names. And that, in spite of the fact that they're neither culturally unified or economically self-sufficient, that's fair and sacred. They would have you believe that. But unfortunately, some of us who are short-sighted and not politically conscious enough, even ignorance, believe it. And then it seems that a further justification of this all, the outside forces resort to all types of propaganda. And they do this to highlight and exploit differences of religion, culture, race, outlook, even political ideology among the people, the oppressed people. And even between regions which share a long history of mutual and commercial and cultural exchange. And I would implore those who don't understand this long history prior to colonial interference, this long history of mutual and commercial and cultural exchange, to study that. It really puts in perspective and smashes the lie that's been believed that Africa was just a war-torn area and these people were always fighting each other, and the European had to come in and settle all this, and through the white man's burden, had to somehow magnanimously teach these Africans civilization. And that's just not true. Even though many of us do understand the truth, there's also many of us that still think those lies were true. So just want to put that in there. It's very, very important, because If you want to have an objective view of your own people, your brothers and sisters, whether here or in Africa, you have to go back to Africa and understand politically what was going on in the 20th century, in early mid 20th century. Very, very impactful in what you're seeing today. It has nothing to do with who built the pyramids. Nobody's arguing that. Let me just cover that right now. If anybody should, lest anybody make a grave mistake and think this is another version, no. No, this is not. This is not a treatise in who built Giza, what pharaonic dynasty ruled. No, we're not talking about that at all. We're talking about the three impacts of Africa, historical impacts, which was traditional Africa, the Islamic impact, which I'm not going to cover. I can cover it another time. But just to give you, that's the second one. And the Euro-Christian impact is what I'm really emphasizing right now in its political manifestations. So I don't want anybody to act like we're talking. No, we're not talking about that. And please don't nobody come to my channel and try to act like I am. All right, it's not true. I would ask you to study and read and stop being so damn ignorant. However, let's move on. Now, with this is kind of this psychological game that's been played had methods aimed and orientated toward the leaders of these liberation movements during this time. Now we're talking about mid-late 50s, toward a brand of nationalism that was based on petty-minded and aggressive chauvinism. It worked for some, but not for others. And also they wanted to steer the liberation movement along a reformist path. But the problem was that kind of liberation. You have to raise it in terms of participating of good indigenous elements in the administration of the colonized territories, or make it appear that those forces that can be easily controlled from the outside are dominant. That's what I'm trying to say here. To try to control everything concerted, even up to and including the type of political liberation and nominal independence you're receiving from your colonial master. That included things like policies of Africanization, which was devoid of any fundamental changes in the political, economic, and administrative structure of the territory. But of course, we also know they had to have accomplices, and in many cases, paid agents. But this transition to neo-colonialism is marked by a success of more or less important measures. And this culminated into a ritual of so-called free elections, what I'm alluding to, organized through methods of intimidation. Local agents selected by the colonial power as worthy representatives are then presented to the people as the champions of the entire liberation movement. You had, during this time, in all parts of Africa, you had widespread factions that had the favor and trust of the people. Those were revolutionary movements. And you had these other people who were representing really the bourgeois elite that expected to actually inherit power from when the Europeans physically leave to do their bidding. That happened in some areas, but in some areas it didn't. The revolutionary fronts of Ghana, Guinea, and Mali, and Kenya, it didn't. So, but yes, they try to put these people up, these puppets, as champions of national independence. And those particular people who were successful working with the foreigners to form colonial governments, they were immediately giving superficial attributes of power. And it's at that moment the puppet government was formed. Now, we'll come back again. I'll end it here at 35 minutes or so. The great part. But we'll come back and we'll talk about this again, part 3 for Neo-Colonialism. Thank you for watching. Give me a comment and a like on this, and I'll be getting back to you soon with that part 3. Thanks.